Hello, thank you everyone for being here today. This is our fourth and final webinar in our series, Leading the Way Spring Series 2024 Solutions for 2024 and Beyond. Today we're here to talk about the realities at the southern border, as well as what leads migrants to start their journey to the U.S. Speakers will share some of their experiences from the field, and we'll also talk about helpful solutions. Here at the forum, we work to support policies that prioritize security and order at the southern border while maintaining humanitarian protections for those who have a valid asylum claim and for treating migrants with respect. We also work to counter disinformation and misinformation about the border. Recognizing that we need lasting solutions to tackle border challenges, the Formwork and other key organizations recently proposed a framework. It offers a workable approach on asylum and border improvements. So this is a big topic, and I suggest we dive right in. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth is Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot and an author, as well as the forum's board chair. I'll let her give a little bit more information about her own background, her expertise, and of course the new book, Elizabeth, we'd love to hear. Thank you for being here. Turning it over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. It's such an honor to be with such esteemed people doing amazing work on the border and in our immigration system. Today, we have some fantastic speakers, Sister Norma Pimentel, and I apologize if I pronounced the last name wrong. I just know you as Sister Norma. She is a sister with the Missionaries of Jesus, Executive Director of Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley, and a great immigration advocate. Sister Norma is known for organizing and overseeing humane responses to arriving migrants. We also have with us today Charles Foster. He is an immigration lawyer and the chairman of Foster LLP based in Houston. Foster served as a senior immigration policy advisor to President George W. Bush in the 2000 and 2004 presidential campaigns, and as an immigration policy advisor to Barack Obama in the 2008 campaign. And finally, we have Michael Debhrul, who is a former U.S. Border Patrol chief, patrol agent, former Customs and Border Protection official, and an ongoing expert on the U.S.-Mexico border. Debhrul is now, he directs the Casa del Sagrado Corazon Migrant Shelter in El Paso. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Now, our topic today is one I'm really quite passionate about. During my most recent government role, which was Assistant Secretary of Counterterrorism during the Trump administration, we observed a drastic uptick in domestic terrorism and targeted violence. There were a number of horrific attacks inspired by a false conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement Theory, the belief that there is a conspiracy to eliminate the white race through mixed race marriages or reducing white birth rates or diseases or vaccines and immigration. Actually, there are many, many versions of this theory. And while they've been around for decades, it received renewed attention in 2011 when a Norwegian neo-Nazi killed 77 people, the overwhelming majority of which were teens. And his justification for that shooting was the Great Replacement Theory. And ever since, that theory has gained prominence among other attackers across the globe, as well as in the United States. And sadly, this obscure conspiracy theory has increasingly moved into the mainstream political rhetoric, with 1 in 3 Americans, let me say that again, 1 in 3 Americans adhere to this conspiracy theory, though this is for the slightly softer version of it, which goes something like immigration in the United States is being used by Democrats to replace Republican voters. So it's not nearly as abhorrent in terms of its racial aspects, but there's still kind of an undercurrent that leads to white supremacy, and for some, it's kind of a gateway or an entree into some of the darker conspiracy theories. Last year marked the 9th year of an ever-increasing number of mass attacks, and the overwhelming majority of those attacks are not coming from Al-Qaeda or ISIS-inspired terrorism. They are coming from domestic violent extremists. This growing threat and its origins came from within what I call my community. And that's what led me to write Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. And let me explain quickly what I mean by that, because it is a bit of a provocative title. And my purpose is not to beat up my community. My purpose is to bring healing. I am a practicing Christian. I grew up in the Bible Belt in North Dallas. I was very politically active in Republican politics for many years. I still consider myself a conservative, though I am no longer affiliated with the Republican Party. And while I don't have time to share all of the data, I will say, if you're interested, you can read the book, or you can just take my word for it as a counterterrorism expert. I can tell you that domestic violent extremism, the threat from that comes from the right. It has expanded beyond the traditional right-wing extremism of white supremacist and militia, and it's increasingly a mass political violence movement with religious inspiration and cover. On January 6th, we saw a deeply concerning confluence of neo-Nazis and militia with people claiming to be Christians, people using Christian symbols, Christian scripture, and framing their protest, and for some their violence, as defending their savior of Donald Trump. As a Christian, I find that very disturbing, not at all reflective of the true teachings of Jesus. But as a counterterrorism person, that frightens me quite significantly, because the most violent, and this goes back thousands of years, the most violent form of extremism is religious extremism. So when you start to see religious elements be brought into other forms of extremism, it is quite alarming. After 9/11, we asked Muslims to speak out against violent jihad. It seems only right that we who think that violence is wrong should take the same stand and take that stand within our communities. And the reason I wrote this book is that after 20 years of us studying why and how people radicalize, we actually have solutions now. We can prevent violence. It is something I'm extremely passionate about, the idea that we can drastically reduce the amount of violence that we're seeing in this country. And while we're not going to go into all of those details in this webinar, if you're interested in that, I would love to have a conversation with you, or consider picking up my book, Kingdom of Rage. Suffice it to say, though, one of the things we're doing here today is a super important part of the solution, separating facts from fiction, uncovering nuance. It's a complicated set of challenges that we face on the border, and educating the population about the complexity, and then also the nuance, but also rehumanizing the challenge, that there are real people involved, not just the immigrants, but the people that are working at the border. And that is what our goal is here today. I kind of want to start out with a picture of what the threat looks like as it pertains to the immigrant community and people that are sharing or working in immigrant communities. During my day job, I work for a company called Moonshot, and we intervene with individuals that are radicalizing online. So we also observe hate, where we see hate and extremist rhetoric in online spaces, domestic violent extremist spaces. So on this slide, you see threats towards immigrant communities in the yellow, and threats or mentions of the word invaders in the orange. And you notice there are two big increases here. One was shortly after the expiration of Title 42, and the other was in January 24, the Supreme Court decision about Texas razor wire ruling. Why does this matter? We now have, I wouldn't say we have causal evidence, but we are close to having corollary level justification to say, when you see rhetoric of hate and violence increase online, you inevitably see hate crimes and violence offline. So when you start to see rhetoric pick up, that is often a concern for us. Here's mentions of great replacement in DVE spaces. You see a pretty significant spike after the October 7th attacks. We've been seeing that in a number of our spaces online that target any number of people. when we had the crisis in Haiti, we saw an uptick in calls of violence towards Haitians. We saw false claims that Haitians were entering the US with weapons. There were a number of threats of violence towards aid agencies that were supporting or helping Haitian migrants that were coming into the US. And then here are some of the other things that we have been seeing in the last year. Anti-immigrant hostilities at a local level, really across the United States because of the busing situation, which we'll talk about today. We have had militias self-deploy on the southern border. We have increased focuses in DVE spaces that talk about like lots of different things, lots of different conspiracy theories. They are increasingly focused on what's happening on the southern border. And then we do have groups that target aid agencies. HIAS was one of the more recent and prominent targets in our reporting. The conspiracy theory ecosystem brings the immigrant challenge into it. There's a lot of conversation about how migrants are actually voting, that this goes into that softer great replacement theory. And we anticipate that will continue to be a challenge this election year. Here are some of the common tactics that are employed. This is probably not a surprise to any of our guests on the panel, but certainly it's important to keep in mind. They use dehumanizing or degrading language, calling immigrants animals or invaders. They oversimplify the problem and the solution. Extremists thrive in black and white thinking, which is why one of the most important things we can be doing is talking about complicated problems with nuance. Hypervigilance, they're constantly keeping people in fear. Fear from an economic standpoint, fear from a security standpoint. That is a common tactic used. And then, of course, there's the bandwagon effect. We have a lot of influencers that talk a lot about the border. They take a moment that might be true and put it on repeat, or they take a moment that they interpret something inaccurately that moves more into the disinformation space. But they, again, play it on repeat for the purpose of driving fear, probably for their purposes for driving clicks and money. But that bandwagon effect certainly is part of the challenge we have in discussing these factors. And with that, we're going to start talking to our experts here on this panel. Now that I've teed up some of the challenges that we are facing as it pertains to security and separating fact from fiction. So I wanted to actually start, Sister Norma, with you and see if you could share with us a little bit about the work that's being done by Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley to provide resources and services at the southern border, but also give us context for the current situation at the border. What are the challenges that border communities and humanitarian agencies like Catholic Charities face?
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to join you and Elizabeth. That was a very good summary of how things are right now happening in our United States. So, here in southern border, RGV, Rio Grande Valley, since day one, actually this June, we're completing our 10th year responding to the immigrant families and children and mothers and coming to our United States through this part of this sector. And right from day one, when we started, it was a response of the community, everybody, all of us. We stepped up and decided that what we were seeing was families, children, mothers, babies, dehydrated in desperate need of help. And that's what moved us all. Why we got involved, why we responded was it doesn't matter who we were, where we stood politically or who we were. The whole community, honestly, from the church community, families in the community, universities, doctors, restaurants, law enforcement. I mean, you name it, all of us, whether it was Border Patrol, city officials, we came together as one community, and we have continued to support this effort here in our area since day one to today. It's like, I remember the first words that the city manager appeared in the first days that we responded, saying, if I had a magic wand, what would that magic wand do for you, sister? And I said, showers, you know. And since then, the mayor said 100%, whatever we need to do to support this effort, we will. And the basic bottom line of what has happened since that day to today is what we were doing and we have continued to do for 10 years is restore human dignity. That was the response as to what was happening and why we, all of us, believed in the restoration of humanity, because that's what we were seeing. Whether they entered this country for whatever reasons they came, because they were fleeing violence in their country, we later found out the actual reality of what was happening, and how Border Patrol processed them and then released them to give them a chance to continue their legal proceedings here in the United States. And we saw them in our communities suffering and hurting. And we stepped up and said, how can I help you? And since that day to today, that's what we here in the RGV have been doing. And so today, you know, numbers had since then to today have gone up and down in great numbers. 2019 was the highest we've ever seen enter our country. No comparison to that, no other year, including this year. Our numbers this year have been one of the lowest that we've seen here in the arts sector. It really is not what is projected to be said in the news or everywhere else, that what is happening at the border, it is not happening here. At least those are how we see it, what is happening. You know, we have a small group of people entering the United States that Border Patrol, for the most part, returns back to their country, most of them, but those that they don't are released and allowed to continue that legal proceedings here in the United States. But the numbers don't amount more than 150 to 200 people a day, you know, at most, you know. And so that's what we're seeing today here at the border. The support of the community continues to be strong and very helpful in wanting to do one thing. You know, we all believe in securing our borders and making sure we know who enters our country, but we also believe in the protection of humanity and responding correctly to a human being that is suffering here in front of us.
Thank you, Sister Norma. Michael, I want to turn to you. You're in El Paso, and I'd love to hear how what you're seeing compares to what Sister Norma is saying, but also, can you talk to us about what the effect of Operation Lone Star is? Is that making your job harder? Is it creating confusion? How has that changed? Maybe explain what Operation Lone Star is, and then how has that changed your job in providing support to migrants after they have legally been granted the right to come in and wait for their notice to appear?
Well, thank you. First of all, Elizabeth, it's a pleasure to be here among such esteemed guests like Sister Norma and Charles. So I think our operation is much like Sister Norma's in that, you know, the Father Garcia here of Sacred Heart threw open the doors in 2019 as an act of faith for those seeking shelter. And I came about this from in a roundabout way, in that I was just volunteering at a shelter in town because of rhetoric, as you mentioned, that I had heard since leaving the service. Which was untrue. So those things I was bothered by. They gave me pause, and so I just started volunteering as a single person. And then suddenly I was thrust into the middle of this, being at Sacred Heart, which at one time had 1,000 people around the church and the shelter. But the issue with Operation Lone Star is I believe that it contributes, as you mentioned, to the rhetoric that we're hearing all the time, and it makes things dangerous. As you mentioned, you have people speak about the border in black and white, and it is not a black and white issue. Immigration on the border and irregular immigration is a very difficult, and it requires many answers. It cannot be captured in a soundbite. What happens with Operation Lone Star, what's happening in El Paso, is that Tuesday through Saturday, Governor Abbott sends buses out, and they go to the shelters. They take people from the shelters, and they're generally sent out to like mostly New York, Chicago, Denver for the most part. And the issue with the buses, for me, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because in town there are believers in the buses. That is, even some of the shelter directors believe that it's a good thing because it relieves pressure from the shelters when we have large numbers of people coming around. But the issue with the buses is that there is no coordination. And so these people, they go of their own free will. Obviously, they're free to move about the country. But Governor Abbott only buses people who cannot get EADs, that is work documents. So people who come across using the preferred method of CBP-1 through the ports of entry are eligible to get work documents in short order. Those who come between the ports of entry are not eligible to do that. And the buses from the Texas Department of Emergency Management only transport those people who cannot get work documents. Therefore, increasing the chaos in middle America, much as we hear from like New York and Denver and Chicago, etc. So that is a problem for us, and also the militarization of the border is significant and dangerous. I think, as you know, we have a tendency, I think, in this country to stand on the sidelines and see the results of this kind of rhetoric. But in 2019, El Paso was thrust right into the middle of this issue with the mass murder of 21 people here at a local Walmart, injured 22. And it was part of that replacement theory, I believe, that caused that. So when people speak about the border in this black and white sound bites, if you will, for them, it's just a black and white sound bite. But I think for us here in El Paso, it signifies so much more.
Thank you for sharing that, Michael. And before I turn to Charles here, I do want to echo what was put in the chat, that if you have questions either about what we're discussing or other questions, please use the Q&A feature. We will be reviewing those questions, and there will be time at the end of our webinar for asking our panelists those questions. Charles, I wanted to ask you about the other side of the busing challenge, which you have the origin, if you will, at the border and the state of Texas sending people out. And then you have the receiving side. You have Denver and Chicago and New York and other cities who, because it's uncoordinated, they end up with a bus will show up and there's people. And I live in Denver, and we had people showing up with no notice, and it is really cold in Denver, and these folks are not used to cold generally, and you throw them in at 5,000 feet above sea level in December. It's actually a crisis because you're going to lose life if you don't get them immediate shelter. So what are the tensions that we're facing with the impact of Operation Lone Star and busing people out to cities that he intentionally states are blue cities or Democrat cities? Like it seems to be some intentionality here to create political strife, but there's like really real impacts for people in those cities as well as the migrants themselves. What do we do with that tension?
Well, first, thank you, Elizabeth, for moderating the panel and asking the questions. And it's really a pleasure to be with Sister Norma again. We spoke at a Texas Monthly panel in McAllen not that long ago, and I have such great admiration for what she does, and you too, Michael, because of you've had this great transition, which is really quite impressive. And I want to thank Jenny and the National Immigration Forum for the work they did. Well, Elizabeth, I think I know Greg, our governor. We used to be in the same law firm. This is actually a couple of observations about that. One, he's obviously doing it for political purposes, and I think he's been quite successful. Because Michael made a good point. He's picking people that are not yet eligible for work authorization, and then he's failing to coordinate. He's not notifying the mayor of Denver or New York or Chicago, but bringing people and sort of dumping them off. And these cities have their own city ordinances, and they have some responsibilities for effectively homeless people that are there in their jurisdiction. So their cities are under a great deal of stress in how to absorb unexpected large numbers of people that, one, do not speak the English language, and two, are not yet work authorized. Mayor Adams and others have have advocated, and there's been some support for pushing so that they could speed up the process by which someone can apply and obtain an employment authorization document. And that's sort of, I feel like that's sort of addressing, not really focusing on the real problem. The U.S. government, this has been very effective politically because because Greg's been able to get a reaction out of the mayors of these cities that are sort of complaining about the lack of an effective border policy. So from a political point of view, you can say it's been a very effective. From a humanitarian point of view, it's not a very Christian, pick up on what you talked about, not a very Christian thing to do. But it's just a symptom of the problem. It's not addressing the real problem. If you want to, we can talk about this. To address the real problem, we've got to address what's going on the border, and that was that the 1980 Refugee Act that established our current asylum laws never ever contemplated that we would have mass numbers of people applying for asylum more or less contemporaneously. A good part of my practice, the years I could remember when one person applying for asylum was sort of a unique one-off situation. In fact, I handled several high-profile cases, one of which was turned into a movie, and we never contemplated what we see on the border. But to address that, the president's trying to do that through executive action, but it's going to take legislation, and unfortunately, one of the two parties is not willing to do that at this time.
And we're going to turn to some of those legislative and executive order actions at the end here. But before we go there, let me ask a little more pointed about the rhetoric, about the fact that some of the work that Michael and Sister Norma do, not them specifically, but the fact that they are providing support to migrants, that has been criticized by elected officials in the state of Texas and elsewhere. And it creates a bit of like there have been myths that have been created that you guys are facilitating human trafficking, or that you're that immigrants are disproportionately more likely to be criminals than the general population, and we're just importing criminals, which is actually not what the data shows. So how does that impact your ability to work? What does and maybe more broadly, Sister Norma, I'll turn to you first, the toxic rhetoric around immigration, because it's just one sentence and it's overly simplistic. What is the impact on migrants themselves? They arrive, are they aware that they're being demonized by a lot of people, and how does that affect them psychologically? And then as they move forward and try to be integrated, as they wait for their legal processing, does that make their life here in the U.S. that much harder? What is it like for the migrant experience in the midst of this toxicity?
Yes, Elizabeth, the reality is that immigrants are not aware of how unfortunate their life will be in the United States due to all this negative rhetoric that you're talking about, and how there's much hatred and view of them as something that is not, that they're more criminals rather than what they truly are. They're victims, they're victims of a process, a system in the world, back home, throughout their journey, and even in the United States, they're victims of. And unfortunately, my concern for them is the fact that they're victims of human trafficking from day one, and it's partly, if we really want to find a solution to human trafficking, we must start there in educating the families of the great risks that they embark in by allowing themselves to be manipulated in this way to come to a country that is really paved out to hurt them greatly, in so many ways in their journey, and they become victims over and over again. And it's so unfortunate, and education of the families, of the many individuals that come with great hope to find peace, to find protection and safety, they don't find that because it's almost as this evil wave of is out to destroy them, and so, and I think that our American public, our families here in the United States need to understand the fact they're also being I call it hijacked. Their values are who they are and what they stand for, who this America of ours stands for, the greatest principles that uphold the dignity of life in every respect. And yet they're driven away from that reality of who we truly are to become turn our backs on innocent victims that become prey to those evil people that are out to take advantage of them in every way possible. Instead of turning to help them, we turn against them, and so my hopes are is that platforms like this one will educate America in understanding the fact that we have a very tough job in making sure that we are protectors of life, protectors of humanity, and that we don't let ourselves be driven into becoming the evil persons that they want to make of us in this country. Because America stands for great principles and is blessed enormously to be a sign of hope, a beacon of hope to the world. And let's hope that we don't lose that in the process of letting ourselves be driven away from what we should and must stand for.
I think that's so beautiful, Sister Norma. Michael, I noticed you had your hand up. Did you want to respond to that question or perhaps one of the earlier conversations?
Well, I wasn't aware that I had my hand up. It was maybe I thought it into existence, but
You must have pressed something, Michael, because your hand is still up.
I pressed something by accident there. I'm sorry. But the unfortunate thing is that, isolated incidents are magnified. As you mentioned, things are said sometimes over and over. So I don't blame people for thinking that there is a migrant crime wave. You hear, unfortunately, there are crimes that are committed by migrants. But the fact is that when you look into the facts regarding migrants and crime, that migrant crime wave, if you will, it just does not hold up. I mean, there was a recent NBC News analysis that studied crime in Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver, New York, and LA, many of the places where Abbott's buses go. The outcome of that was that overall crime is actually down in those areas. And there's a great study, the Marshall Project, which was affected by 3 major universities. It studied the correlation between the increase in migrant population in some metropolitan cities and the correlation to crime. What it indicated was that in the U.S., it was between 1980 and 2016, the population of migrants has increased by 118%, and crime was actually down 36%. The cool thing about the study was that you could enter kind of any metropolitan area that you wanted, and it would give you the charts, the resulting charts. And virtually every one of those that I entered indicated that large metropolitan areas that had an increase in migrant population, their crime rates were down. For example, Atlanta had a significant increase during that time, almost 600% increase in their migrant population, and their crime was down 51%. So I'm not sure what that means. Maybe we need more migrants. I'm not sure. But,
just to add to that, Michael, here in the Rio Grande Valley, our statistics are that crime rate has gone down tremendously, more so than ever before. And people always say, is it safe to be in the RGV? It's probably the safest city and area in the United States, honestly.
Yes, actually, El Paso is one of the safest cities in the country. And but again, these are the things that people hear. So it's understandable that people would think that there's a migrant crime wave, but the more you look into that, the facts do not hold up that idea. A lot of people think that all the drugs are being brought in by the migrants, but the truth is that between 92 to 94% of all the drugs that come into the country come through the ports of entry. And that also that a lot of migrants are smuggling in other migrants and drugs, etc. But I was looking at a website, the Sentencing Commission website, which clearly indicates that most of the people that are arrested for smuggling or that have been sentenced, a great majority are U.S. citizens. So, I mean, as you mentioned, these are the things that we have to talk about all the time. And I think I volunteered just as a private citizen, but maybe my place is to give some fidelity to this discussion, as we all are trying to do here today. I think that's what's important, most important. We need to talk logically with lowered temperatures about what we can do to support the border, to support the United States and the migrants. Those two things are not necessarily opposed to each other.
Thank you, Michael. Those are really great points. And I want to point out that in the chat, you saw some resources that Larry posted. The forum does great work in identifying those myths and then publishing the facts that are all well sourced to be able to counteract some of those conspiracy theories that get generated. Jenny, I was going to ask one more question if you're okay with that. I wanted to turn to Charles and ask if you could give us a sense. This is going to be a two-pronged question here. One is the Biden administration's faced a ton of criticism that it hasn't done enough to impede irregular migration at the U.S.-Mexico border. At the same time, they have encountered most of the people they're encountering at the border have actually been removed or returned or expelled. So the narrative might not actually bear up against the facts, but nevertheless, it's an election year and he is looking to show that he's taking action. And so there is reporting out that tomorrow he is expected to issue an executive order considering using its authority under the INA Section 212F, which was the same authority the Trump administration used for the Muslim travel ban, as well as restricting migration at the border. So I guess I'm looking for your take here on how has the Biden administration done, what your thoughts are on this new executive order, and what more should we be looking for? Obviously, I think all of us on this panel would say Congress needs to act. It's just really frustrating that Congress refuses to do its job in this space, now going almost on 20 years. But what can an executive branch, what can the Biden administration do in this space? And what are your thoughts on this new EO that appears to be coming out tomorrow?
Well, so many questions, but I am equal opportunity critic. I think the Biden administration should have focused on this issue earlier. I think there was a hope that it might I talked to his policy people from time to time, and they didn't. I was always a little surprised that they didn't seem to take it as serious as I thought it was, just looking at polling. So early, the Biden administration tried a number of things, and some of which he really didn't want to brag about, because some of which overlapped with what the Trump administration tried. For a while, they were implementing Title 42 as well, but once the pandemic was over, that became impossible to do. Republicans like to say remain in Mexico, but that was never as effective as they said. That was an agreement with Mexico. Mexico since has now pulled out of it, and there was a 9th, I think 11th, either 9th or 11th Circuit case upholding, finding that it exceeded the constitutional authority. So so the Biden administration is, they try to do something, and that is to get legislation passed. But then once the president came out strongly in favor of it, I think for obvious political reasons, the Republicans, at least Donald Trump, wanted to keep that for a political issue. So tomorrow it appears from the papers that the president is going to take a new executive action using Title F, Section 212F of the Immigration Nationality Act, to cut off at a certain point if the numbers exceed, the daily numbers exceed 4,000 or 5,000, that they can impede the entry of individuals and in some ways hold them back. I think that the president has got to do something, because he's not only hemorrhaging voters, but just from a strictly policy point of view, I recognize one day that the last real significant immigration legislation passed almost 40 years ago, in 86. The 90 Act increased numbers, but that's a long time, and the prospects today are no better. So unless the president does something, not only will he not be elected, but getting any immigration legislation passed will be very difficult. The problem with that is it's probably going to be more symbolic, because there's just like President Trump found out He used a 212F, but there's a Supreme Court case that basically says that it cannot specifically do away with a very specific congressional act, which does allow people who are physically in the U.S. to apply for asylum under certain conditions. So I think he will do that. Whether I don't think he'll go into effect, because I think there will be at least one probably the same court in the Northern District of California will enjoin it, and it will probably be upheld by the Ninth Circuit. As you said, the answer is it's got to be done legislatively. We have to address our asylum laws. The forum has a very good proposal on that, and I would recommend that you go to their website and check that out.
Thank you, Charles. And I know we're going to turn to a final question or two. I just wanted to say before we do that, that we've thrown some resources in the chat. We actually have border resources directory that a few folks have referred to. You can get context, fact sheets. You can see the border framework. There's a number of pieces that you can grab there. And then lastly, this is our last webinar of the spring series of Leading the Way, but don't be dismayed. We're going to gather in person for the large Leading the Way in Washington, D.C., November 12th through 14th. And you probably know that timing. It's just on the other side of the election. We would love for you to mark your calendars and plan to join us at that time. Elizabeth, back to you for final questions.
Okay, we're going to turn to Q&A, and I have a couple of really good questions, panelists. One of them is, when the conversation about the border is complex, like there's a lot of nuance here, there's a lot of brokenness. Is there a one sentence or a one paraphrase line that you use to help kind of push back against the overly simplistic rhetoric? And I'm going to add on to that question that one person asked with a question another person asked. Can you share resources or recommendations for how to counter toxic rhetoric, especially in the local church, with nuance, wisdom, and compassion, while also keeping the conversation simple enough for those of us who are not experts? So kind of looking for that way that you can either insert doubt into the conspiracy theories or create curiosity in your audience. Do you guys have any tips or tricks that you use in your engagement with folks?
Well, I would like to just say that what I found that really helps when it comes to people who are against helping an immigrant, what as I refer to as illegal aliens, I say, come and see. Let me show you who they are, so that you can then decide for yourself whether what your decision is correct or not. And really, when actually somebody actually comes and really looks at the families and listens to their stories and understands that reality, it changes the person. It helps them understand them as a human being, as a person, and it changes everything, helps them understand that, yes, we must secure our borders, we must secure our United States and find the right way to move forward in this time and age, but we also cannot just turn our backs on humanity.
What I say to people that are so upset about this is that this has never been properly viewed in the right context. This is a humanitarian crisis. That last year in Europe, they had over 5 million people seeking asylum. We talk about the Venezuelans coming to our border, but more Venezuelans, I think Colombia, a much smaller country with fewer resources, has accepted 4 or 5 times more Colombian refugees than have come to the border. And so we act like this is an invasion, like an armed invasion, like Michael has talked to, that being betrayed is criminal, but this is a humanitarian crisis. But it's not. Our asylum laws were never intended to deal with humanitarian crisis.
Yes, and I would say I agree wholeheartedly with Sister Norma, and that is, come down here to the border. There are a couple of groups here. For example, Father Garcia also established a group called Encuentro, and I believe that you and I met on one of those groups, Elizabeth. And also there's a group, there's an organization called Ibarra here who sponsors groups coming to the border. And they stay here between 5 and 10 days. They're immersion groups. They come and they talk to many speakers and experts, and they stand on the fence. I think that brings great understanding. That's what we need. You know, I have traveled throughout the country, and everywhere I go, I meet people who have either been in these groups that have come to visit, and or they send me emails, texts, follow-up questions and discussions, and that brings great understanding. I think that has great potential to bring understanding into the middle of the country as to kind of what's happening here. It is so important. Come down to the border, come visit me or Sister Norma, and let us walk with you. And I think that you have a greater appreciation and actually know the truth about what's happening here at the border. I think that is the most important thing. I've had great discussions, and when people come in, I say, hey, let's talk. I give a presentation, but the most important thing I stress is let's talk, because we're not talking anymore. Talk to me, challenge me, let's learn from each other. I think that's really what's important now these days where we're so polarized.
I love all of those answers. I'll add to it from my countering violent extremism perspective. Things we know don't work, arguing somebody out of their ideology or their policy agenda. What does work? Proximity. So what all three of our panelists have just talked about is creating proximity to those who have had the experience with the immigration system, with a migrant journey. Proximity changes hearts, and as logical as we think we are, we're actually much more emotionally driven than we want to admit. So if your goal is to change hearts, the way you change hearts is through proximity and through relationship, through being curious or asking questions. Usually the logic kind of fills in afterwards. So it's important to have those myth busters. It's important to know the facts, but actually helping somebody along the path to seeking the truth does require not actually arguing with them, but rather being curious and interested and inviting them into that proximity. And to that end, the forum actually has two really amazing groups. And I did have the opportunity through Ibarra to go to El Paso with one of these groups. It is an amazing journey, but for the church, if whoever asked that question, if it happens to be a woman that you're hoping will explore more of these issues, we have Women of Welcome and We Welcome, both of whom are reaching evangelical women kind of in different spaces in their faith journey, as well as in maybe their political journey. There's one of those groups is much more conservative. One of them might be considered a center-right, moderate, or slightly progressive voice. But if you want to ask more about that, we can get you information about those groups and how somebody can get involved. We are at time. I want to thank our panelists for just your expertise, but more importantly, the amazing work that you're doing in creating hospitable places, being the hands and feet of Jesus, being just the hospitable Americans that we should do, that wonderful vision that Sister Norma laid out, that we are an amazing country with many blessings, that we have the opportunity to be able to care for others. So I thank you everybody for participating, and feel free to follow up, use the resources in the chat to access more. And if you have follow-up questions, we'd be happy to do that as well. Thanks everybody for your time.